Hey guys, it's Daniel. Welcome back.
The following is from Keith Richards' biography, Life. Quote, "My Aunt Patty had been in possession of a letter of mine for nearly 50 years and had never been seen outside of my family. She was still alive when she gave me the letter in 2009. In it, I describe among other things the moment I met Mick Jagger on the train station at Dartford in 1961. The letter was written in April of 1962, only 4 months later, when Mick and I were already hanging out. The following is an excerpt from that letter. You know, I was keen on Chuck Berry, and I thought I was the only fan for miles, but one morning at Dartford Station, I was holding one of Chuck's records when a guy I knew from primary school, from 7 to 11 years old, came up to me. He's got every record Chuck Berry ever made, and all his mates have too. They are all rhythm and blues fans, real R&B. Jimmy Reed, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Howlin' Wolf, John Lee Hooker, and all the Chicago bluesmen, real low-down stuff, marvelous. Bo Diddley, he's another great. Anyways, the guy on the station, he is called Mick Jagger. I end the letter by writing Love, Keef. Did Mick and I hit it off? You get in a carriage with the guy that's got Rockin' at the Hops by Chuck Berry on chess records and the best of Muddy Waters also under his arm, you are gonna hit it off. He's got the Henry Morgan's treasure. It's the real stuff. I had no idea how to get a hold of that. I realize now I'd met him once before outside Dartford Town Hall when he was selling ice creams for a summer job. He must have been about 15, just before he left school, about 3 years before we actually started the Stones, because he just happened to mention that he occasionally did a dance around there doing Buddy Holly and Eddie Coltrane stuff. It just clicked in my mind that day. I bought a chocolate ice cream. I don't know, it might have been a cornet. I pled the statute of limitations, and then I didn't see him again until the fateful day on the train. And he was carrying this stuff. Where the heck did you get this? It was always all about records. From when I was 11 or 12 years old, it was who had the records who you hung out with. They were precious things. I was lucky to get 2 or 3 singles every 6 months or something. And he said, well, I got this address. He was already writing off to Chicago and funnily enough to Marshall Chess, who had a summer job with his dad in the mailing room there and who later became the president of Rolling Stones Records. It was a mail order thing like Sears, Roebuck. He'd seen this catalog, which I had never seen, and we just started talking. He was still singing in a little band doing Buddy Holly stuff, apparently. I had never heard about any of that. I said, well, I play a little. I said, come on round, play some other stuff. I almost forgot to get off at Sid Cup because I was still copying down the matrix numbers of the Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters records he happened to have with him. Rockin' at the Hops, Chess Records CHD-9259. Mick had seen Buddy Holly play at the Woolwich Granada. It's one of the reasons I cottoned to him, and because he had far more contacts than me. And because this man's got some stuff. I was well out of the loop. I was a yokel compared to Mick, in a way. He had the London thing down, studying at the London School of Economics, meeting a wider range of people. I didn't have the money, I didn't have the knowledge, I just read the magazines, like New Music Express. Eddie Coltrane appearing with Buddy Holly. Wow, when I grow up, I'll get a ticket. Of course, they all died before then. Almost immediately after we met, we'd sit around and he'd start to sing and I'd start to play, and hey, that ain't bad. It wasn't difficult. We had nobody to impress except us, and we weren't looking to impress ourselves. I was learning too. With Mick and me at the beginning, we'd get, say, a new Jimmy Reed record, and I'd learn the moves on guitar, and he would learn the lyrics and get it down, and we would just dissect it as much as possible. Does it go like that? Yeah, it does, as a matter of fact. And we had fun doing it. I think we both knew we were in a process of learning, and it was something that you wanted to learn, and it was 10 times better than school. I suppose at the time it was the mystery of how it was done and how could you sound like that? This incredible desire to sound hip and cool, and then you bump into a bunch of guys that feel the same way, and via that you meet other players and people and you think it actually can be done. Mick and I must have spent a year while the Stones were coming together and before, record hunting. There were others like us, trawling far and wide and meeting one another in record shops. If you didn't have money, you would just hang and talk, but Mick had these blues contacts. There were a few record collectors, guys that somehow had a channel through to America before anybody else. There was people like Dave Godin up in Bexleyheath, who had an in with Sue Records, and so we heard artists like Charlie and Inez Fox, Solid Duty Soul, who had a big hit with Mockingbird a little after this. Godin had the reputation for having the biggest soul and blues collection in the southeastern part of London, or even beyond, and Mick got to know him and so he would go round. He wouldn't nick records or steal them, there were no cassettes or taping. But sometimes there would be a little deal where somebody would do a Grundig reel-to-reel copy for you of this and that. And such a strange bunch of people. Blues aficionados in the 60s were a sight to behold. They met in little gatherings like early Christians, but in the front rooms in southeast London. There was nothing else necessarily in common amongst them at all. They were all different ages and occupations. It was funny to walk into a room where nothing else mattered except he's playing the new Slim Harpo, and that was enough to bond you all together. There was a lot of talk of matrix numbers. Mick sometimes had the use of his parents' Triumph Herald at the weekend, and I remember we went to Manchester to see a big blues show, and there's Sonny Terry, and there's Brownie McGee, and John Lee Hooker and Muddy Waters. He was the one we wanted to see particularly, but we also wanted to see John Lee. There were others like Memphis Slim. It was a whole revue that was going through Europe, and Muddy came on, acoustic guitar, Mississippi Delta stuff, and played a magnificent half an hour. And then there was an interval, and he came back with an electric band, and they virtually booed him off the stage. He plowed through them like a tank, as Dylan did a year or so later at the Manchester Free Trade Hell. But it was hostile. And that's when I realized that people were not really listening to the music, they just wanted to be part of this wised-up enclave. Passions ran very high in those days. It wasn't just mods against bikers or the loathing of the threatened trad jazzers for us rock and rollers. There were micro squabbles almost unbelievable to imagine now. The BBC was giving live coverage to the Beaulieu Jazz Festival in 1961, and they had to actually shut down the broadcast when trad jazz and modern jazz fans started to beat the crap out of each other, and the whole crowd lost control. The purists thought of blues as part of jazz, so they felt betrayed when they saw electric guitars. A whole bohemian subculture was threatened by the leather mob. There was certainly a political undercurrent to this. Alan Loxman and Ewan McCall, singers and famous folk song collectors who were in patriarchs or ideologues of the folk boom, took a Marxist line that this music belonged to the people and must be protected from the corruption of capitalism. That's why commercial was such a dirty word in those days. In fact, the slanging matches in the music press resembled real political fisticuffs. Phrases like tripe mongers, legalized murder, selling out. There were ludicrous discussions about authenticity, yet the fact is there was actually an audience for the blues artists in England. In America, most of those artists had gotten used to playing cabaret acts, which they quickly found out didn't go down well in the UK. Here, you could play the blues. Big Bill Bronzy realized he could pick up a bit of dough if he switched from the Chicago blues to being a folksy bluesman for a European audience. Half of those black guys never went back to America, because they realized that they were being treated like crap at home, and meanwhile, lovely Danish birds were tripping over themselves to accommodate them here. Why go back? They'd found out that after World War II, they were treated well in Europe, certainly in Paris, like Josephine Baker, Champion Jack Dupree, and Memphis Slim. That's why Denmark became a haven for so many jazz players in the 50s. Mick and I had a totally identical taste in music. We never needed to question or explain, it was all unsaid. We'd hear something, we'd both look at each other at once. Everything was to do with sound. We'd hear a record and go, that's wrong, that's faking, that's real. It was either that stuff's great or that stuff isn't, no matter what kind of music we were talking about. I really like some pop music if it was the stuff, but there was a definite line of what was good and what wasn't. Very strict. First off, I think to Mick and me, it was like, we've got to learn more. There's more out there because then we branched out to rhythm and blues, and we loved the pop records. Give me the Ronettes or the Crystals. I could listen to them all night. But the minute we went on stage trying to do one of those songs, it was like, go to the broom closet. I was looking for the core of it, the expression. You would have no jazz without blues out of slavery. The most recent and particular version of slavery, not us poor Celts, for example, under the Roman boot. They put those people through misery, not just in America. But there's something produced by its survivors that is very elemental. It's not something you take in the head. It's not something you take in the guts. It's beyond the matter of the musicality of it, which is very variable and flexible. There's loads of kinds of blues. There is very light kind of blues. There's very swamp kind of blues. And it's the swamp kind basically where I exist. Listen to John Lee Hooker. He has a very archaic form of playing. Most of the time it ignores chord changes. They're suggested but not played. If he's playing with somebody else, that player's chord will change, but he stays. He doesn't move. And it's relentless. And the most important thing apart from the great voice and that relentless guitar, was the foot stomp, a crawling king snake. He carried his own 2x4 wood block to amplify his stomps. Bo Diddley was another one who loved to do just that one elemental chord, everything on one chord. The only thing that moves is the vocal and the way you're playing it. I really only learned more about this later on. Then there was the power in people's voices, like Muddy, John Lee, Bo Diddley. It wasn't loud necessarily, it just came from way down deep. The whole body was involved. They weren't just singing from the heart, they were singing from the guts. That always impressed me. And that's why there's a lot of difference between blues singers that don't play an instrument and blues singers that do, be it piano or guitar, because they have to develop their own way of call and respond. You're going to sing something and then you've got to play something. That answers or asks another question and then you resolve. And so your timing and that phrasing has to become different. If you're a solo singer, you tend to concentrate on the singing, and most times hopefully for the better. But sometimes it can be divorced from the music in a way. One day, Mick was hanging out with Dick Taylor, his mate from grammar school who was at Sid Cup. I joined them in late '61. There was also Bob Beckwith, the guitar player who had the amplifier, which made him really important. Quite often in the early days, there was one amplifier with 3 guitars going through it. We called ourselves Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys. My guitar this time, an F-hole archtop Hofner steel string, was Blue Boy. The words written on its face, and because of that, I was the Blue Boy. That was my very first steel string guitar. You'll only find pictures of it in the club gigs before the takeoff. I bought it secondhand in Ivor Mayrant's off Oxford Street. You knew it had had one owner because of the patches and sweat marks on the fretboard. He's either playing up top, the fiddle bits, or he's a chord man. It's like a map, a seismograph. And I left it either on the Victoria line or the Bakerloo line on the London Underground. But where better to bury it than the Bakerloo line? It left scars. We gathered in Bob Beckwith's front room in Bexleyheath. Once or twice, Dick Taylor used his house. At the time, Dick was very studious. You'd put him in the pursuit vein, which didn't stop him becoming a pretty thing in a couple of years. He was the real thing, a good player. He had the feel. But he was very academic about his blues, and actually it was a good thing because we were all a bit off the flight. We just as soon break into Not Fade Away or That'll Be the Day or Come On Everybody or straight into I Just Want to Make Love to You. We saw it all as the same kind of stuff. Bob Beckwith had a Grundig, and it was on that we made the first tape of any of us together, our first attempt at recording. Mick gave me a copy of it. He bought it back at an auction. A reel-to-reel tape, and the sound quality is terrible. Our first repertoire included Around and Round and Reelin' and Rockin' by Chuck Berry, Bright Lights, Big City by Jimmy Reed, and to put the icing on the cake, La Bamba, sung by Mick with pseudo-Spanish words.